Well, this is Dateline news and conversation. Unfortunately, we just can't avoid it. The topic tonight, he commands the 24/7 news cycle, Donald Trump. Did he chicken out again on Iran? Uh, you know, it was reported that in a very small meeting, he went off and said maybe we should use tactical nukes. He's really unhinged. I was at a conference yesterday, gave a talk at Levadia Palace with some 50 plus academics, professors, people from NGOs, journalists. The media was there covering it. And the talk was about war and the possibility of nuclear war. Most people there felt that nuclear war was not going to happen. I'm not so sure. But I also want to talk about the effects of what Trump is doing uh, against Iran and what Americans are thinking when inflation is rising as well as cost on everything. And then we'll talk a little bit about war and the happy talk in the United States that Ukraine is gaining the upper hand in the special military operation in Ukraine. My guest is one of our favorites, Peter Kuznick. Peter, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Regis. Every time I see you, the news only gets worse. The global situation deteriorates. The threat of broader war increases. And there's very little positive to talk about, except that we're still here. And as long as we're both still here, that means that there's a possibility of better things happening, ending wars, having peaceful development, dealing with the kinds of things that people around the world need rather than what the militarists fantasize about.
Well, I had a friend recently send me an email and said, can you not talk about a vision of a better world, the kind of a world we'd like to have, and that by thinking in this way, positive thoughts, actions will happen. And my response to that was, well, people have been dreaming about this for a long time. So have I, but it's not happening. And then I said, when you're in a war zone like I am in Crimea, we are being shelled daily. People are being killed. Transportation is being blocked. There isn't any petrol for cars. And, we're at the point where if we cannot get these truckers to cross the bridge because they're afraid of getting blown up, it's going to be a shortage of food. And so what I said to this friend of mine, I said, it's pretty hard to think of a beautiful world, a new scenario when you're getting bombed every day. Anyway, that's where we're at. Peter, I want to talk about Trump from your perspective, and you pay attention to this every day. The report was that he started to bomb Iran again, then backed off, and then said the same thing, Peter, he's been saying for the last few months. Oh, we're so close to a deal. And then the stock market, boom, goes up. But Peter, as long as this continues, people in America are seeing inflation rise as well as prices. Your comments on all of this help me understand what the heck is going on from your perspective.
Regis, I'm afraid you understand it all too well. How many times do you have to watch the same movie till you know what the ending is? So Trump, for the 37th time, has announced that we're within hours or at worst days of a peace deal. This he says over and over and over again. And then every time it's proven to be wrong. The problem is there are two other countries who have a say right now, effectively have a veto. Trump does desperately want to end this war. I give him credit for it in the sense that we realize that he started this war. It was a war of choice based on lies, based on aggression, based on breaking international law, based on killing thousands and thousands of human beings who should still be on the planet, and based on destroying or greatly weakening the world economy. But Trump does desperately want to end it for reasons that we'll talk about in a minute. However, Netanyahu does not want to end it. Netanyahu finally found an American president who would go to war with Iran, and he doesn't want to let go. That gives Israel its fantasy about manipulating the United States to help do its dirty work against Iran and potentially against Hezbollah. So Israel has no interest in ending this war. And it was really the Israeli bombing of Hezbollah in Beirut that triggered the new round of hostilities. And so then Iran bombed Israel and hit some U.S. assets in the area. Israel retaliated. The U.S. got in. And so Israel has no interest in ending this. And secondly, the Iranians have little interest in ending this. The Iranians want to end it on their terms. The way they see it, they were negotiating in good faith back in June and again in February, and the U.S. and Israel attacked, sucker punched both times, and broke international law and attacked inside Iran, killed Iranian leaders, destroyed Iranian infrastructure, wreaked havoc inside Iran, and the Iranians came back stronger than ever. Iran is now in the strongest position it's been in decades, in more than decades. And so they control the Strait of Hormuz. They have their assets in the region. You saw the Houthis attacking Israel this week and threatening to completely shut down the Red Sea again. We've seen Hezbollah fighting against Israel. We see resurgence in Gaza. So from the standpoint of the Iranians, they're in a very strong position. Yes, they're suffering. But they figure the Iranian people have been suffering under sanctions and worse since 1979. When I track back, I go back to 1953 when the CIA overthrew Mossadegh because he was too progressive, because he thought that Iranian oil should be in the interest of Iran, not in the interest of Britain, and nationalize the British oil interests. And so we've seen this situation for decades and decades. Iran has its boot on Trump's neck, and it realizes how desperate Trump is. And so the thing we've learned about war, we learned it about Vietnam. You and I learned this lesson. The U.S. won every battle in the Vietnam War, but it lost the war because it didn't understand that it wasn't a war over territory. It wasn't a war over battlefield victories. It was a war over time. And the United States eventually had to get out of Vietnam, while Vietnam could never get out of Vietnam. The same thing now in Iran. The longer this goes on, the better position Iran is in, and the weaker position Trump is in. As you mentioned, the recent economic reports, well, 2 or 3 days ago, the latest inflation figures came out, and they jumped from something like 2.8% in May or in April to 4.2% in May. The highest inflation has been in the US since 2002. Also, then yesterday, the wholesale inflation figures came out, and wholesale inflation, measuring what the companies pay, what business pays, is up 6.5%. That will soon get transferred to American consumers. And so the economy in the US is shaky at best, and the American consumers are hurting and angry and tired and pessimistic about the future. On top of that, all the reports prove that the world's oil reserves are dwindling. At the start of the war, 4 months ago, people could say, well, Japan and South Korea and India have these vast oil reserves that they've accumulated and gas reserves, and so they won't be feeling the pressure really for months. Well, they've been feeling the pressure, but what they realize is that we're about to hit a point where those prices are going to skyrocket, and then they're going to be hurting much worse than they are now. We already see the effects of fertilizer shortages in Africa and Latin America and elsewhere. Because of the cutoff of fertilizer supplies from that region, we're seeing now farmers not being able to grow the crops that were expected, which means we're going to go through a very bad period in terms of world food supplies, world hunger, and world starvation. So right now, Israel has no interest in ending this war. Iran has no rush to end this war. And the only one who's desperate for a resolution is Trump. So what we see is Trump trying to manipulate the markets, Trump lying constantly, Trump drawing upon the same playbook, which is to make threats. We're going to wipe out Iranian civilization. We're going to destroy Iran's infrastructure. We're going to bomb them back to the Stone Age. We're going to hit them harder than they've ever been hit. And the Iranians shrug it off and say, there's Taco. He always makes these threats and he always chickens out. But the danger is, as you suggest, maybe one of these times, these idiots don't chicken out. And we see him being surrounded by the Hegseths and the Millers and the Rubios and these jokers who he keeps on appointing or suggesting for new director of national intelligence. The people who are around him, the quality of his advisors has been diminishing daily. People flee, they leave, they don't want to be part of this administration. You've got Joe Kent, the counterterrorism chief, resigning and saying that Trump lied about Iran's nuclear weapons program. You've got Tulsi Gabbard being replaced. Tulsi hated this war. She opposed it from the beginning. She was very close to Joe Kent. And so Trump gets rid of her and now is trying to find a replacement. The danger is we've never seen such terrible quality leadership. Trump is a fool surrounded by bigger fools whose only game plan is to hit and hit and hit. As Hegseth says, we negotiate with bombs. As Miller says, it's the law of the jungle. Might makes right. And we're the strongest in the world. Well, with that kind of thinking, anything is possible. So Seymour Hersh, as you referred to, mentioned in one of his pieces this week that Trump seriously proposed or threw out the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons in Iran. Others in the meeting rejected that out of hand. And so Trump backed down. But he's desperate, and a desperate man with a limited mentality and a tiny IQ and a little brain who loves violence, whose idea of commemorating the 250th anniversary of the United States and commemorating a document like the Declaration of Independence, which was a visionary document that this pea-brained, tawdry little human being wants to celebrate it with a ridiculous fight at the White House, or wherever he's holding it. It's beyond belief, beyond caricature, beyond stupidity, beyond the sign of how degraded the U.S. has become. So his MAGA idiots are going to flood into Washington. They're shutting the city down, and it's tawdry. It just shows what kind of taste this man has, who wants to gild the White House, wants to put his name on the Kennedy Center, wants this new ballroom, wants the Arc de Trump, wants to paint the whatever it is, the water there. It's a sign of such idiocy that the world looks on in disbelief. So it's tragic.
Boy, I don't have anything to add to that, Peter. I really appreciate how you've described it. I mean, my only question is, what the hell is wrong with the American people? Peter, they're feeling it now in the pocketbook, and they're feeling it where it hurts. More and more people. Yet, and I don't follow American sports anymore. It's very difficult to follow American sports from here. I love sports. I love the competition. I realize it's all a big business, and it's basically designed now to distract the population from what's going on. But those arenas are full. Basketball playoffs, hockey playoffs, baseball starting. Not enough Americans are feeling the pain yet. But Peter, the thing that I just can't, it really bothers me that there isn't an uprising in America
Well,
against wait a minute, let me finish.
okay.
Against what you just described,
Yeah.
Trump's behavior. I mean, I just can't get my head around it. Why Americans are not in the streets surrounding the White House, millions of people wanting to get rid of this idiot. Peter, I just can't understand that.
Yeah, it's hard to understand. However, the good news is that millions of people do show up for every protest. The good news is that Trump's approval rating is barely 1/3. His approval on the economy is lower than 30%. His approval on the war is barely 30%. Reason you've seen the United States before. Every other war the U.S. has been in at this point had 70, 80, 90% approval. This time, it's barely 30%. So the American people are registering this, but with a certain kind of passivity that you and I find very frustrating. Instead of millions of people flooding into Washington to see some idiotic quasi-sports event, they should be flooding in to protest and to force Trump out of office. But Trump is desperate because he knows there is no support for the war. And when he comes up with a so-called peace plan, which is going to be a compromise because Iran holds the cards, you see who comes out and attacks him. It's Mike Pompeo. It's Ted Cruz. It's Roger Wicker. It's John Bolton. It's Lindsey Graham, of all people. It's one of these Trump acolytes after another, these MAGA idiots, these hawks who attack Trump and say the deal he's getting is worse than what Obama came away with. And so Trump hears that. He hears the O word, Obama, worse than Obama, and Trump repudiates it and says, no, that's false news. I never talked about that. Even now, when Trump says we're hours away from a new deal, the Iranians put out what they've actually agreed to, and Trump says they're lying. They're lying. We're going to bomb them back to the Stone Age. They don't deserve. They shouldn't stop. They should stop their lying. And the false news should stop reporting it. The reality, as we know, is that Trump is perhaps the biggest liar on the face of the planet right now. In his first term, the Washington Post cataloged 30,573 lies that Trump told. Well, he's lying at a much faster pace in his second term. And so, he gets caught all the time. But as a pathological liar and as a pathological narcissist, Trump doesn't even care about getting caught over and over again. He learned from Roy Cohn and others, stay on the offensive, attack, 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 deny everything, and somehow it's going to work to your benefit. The reality is it doesn't. He has so little support among the American people, but what they figure is that they don't have to come to Washington because we're in a stalemate right now, in a quagmire, and they can wait till the midterm elections when they're going to show how much they despise Trump. You have to remember that there have been so many off-year elections already, last year and this year, and the Democrats have prevailed in every one but one. And so Trump and his allies are desperate right now, which is why he's under so much pressure, because the Republican Party, which fears him and refuses to break with him publicly, puts pressure on him behind the scenes to change his way. And we're going to see the Republicans getting their heads handed to them, despite their cheating, despite their gerrymandering, despite their trying to rig the elections, despite Trump's idiotic lies about the California elections being stolen. When everybody who knows anything knows that even when the Republicans win, when Schwarzenegger wins in California, it takes weeks and weeks and weeks to get the results in. This is the stupid way California runs its elections. However, if you look at Louisiana, a Republican red state, it takes them longer to count the votes. And it's 1/10 the size or less of California and takes them just as long to count the votes. This is not vote fraud. Any intelligent American citizen knows that. But Trump makes the lie. He throws it out there anyway because he doesn't care about the truth at all.
Wow, Peter, I want to shift now to back to Iran and the closure of the Straits of Hormuz. 20% of the world's everything goes through there: gas, oil, fertilizer, food, whatever. But you mentioned briefly the Houthis are threatening to shut down the Red Sea. And and even if they don't do that, just prolonging the shutdown of the Straits of Hormuz is beginning to have an effect all over the world. The disruption of the global supply chain. People in the global south probably are already feeling it more than anybody. And we're talking starvation.
Yeah.
We're talking the lack of fertilizer to grow food. We're talking about the lack of basic essentials that they won't get. Even if the Houthis don't shut down the Red Sea, and they want to do that to punish Israel. Peter, forget about Trump. If we go up to a higher level and look at what's happening globally, I think what we're seeing is the formation of a perfect storm. Everything that's happening, the wars in Iran, in Ukraine, the trouble that Trump is fomenting everywhere, prolonging this conflict with Iran. I don't know whether you agree, but I think we're headed for the perfect storm. It's a global economic worse than depression. I don't know. Tell me I'm crazy.
No, the tragic thing is you're not crazy. We've already seen scores of millions of people plunge back into poverty. We are potentially seeing mass starvation. The global South, which was already on shaky footing, but was beginning to assert itself and reject the US domination of the world economy, has very few resources to defend itself. So we see China and we see uh, Russia, and India, where we seem to be making progress. In July, when you saw Putin and Modi holding hands and meeting with Xi Jinping, there was hope that the world would go a different direction. But what we've seen instead is a very sick militarization of the of the planet. I had a meeting this week. I got asked to dinner by the nuclear expert from the Chinese embassy here in Washington, D.C. You know what his biggest concern is right now? Japan either developing its own nuclear weapons or hosting U.S. nuclear weapons. Takaichi, who seems to be rejecting the three non-nuclear principles in Japan, is so hawkish that China is very, very alarmed. So Taiwan is still a crucial issue, which we could talk about. I was at an event last night at the Russian embassy, the Russia Day commemoration, and I talked to a lot of my Russian friends, several of whom are Russian citizens who now live in the United States. And, the world is tired of war. But what we're seeing is this crazy hawkishness everywhere. So the Europeans are trying to scare their publics into sacrificing their education, their housing, their childcare, their food programs in order to spend more money on their militaries. And the idea is that Putin poses a threat to NATO. Well, maybe in some sense he does, because we see Russian officials saying that if the Baltic states and other European countries allow allow Ukraine to use their airspace to attack inside of Russia, then they are complicit in that and potentially targets. But as Putin makes clear over and over again, the last thing he wants is a war with NATO or a war with Europe. But the European leaders, we saw again the E3 this week, calling for increased European military spending in order to support Ukraine. Well, Zelensky says what they need are air defense systems. But the problem is that air defense systems are in short supply everywhere. We see now the latest, Trump talking about cutting 30% from air defense in Europe to transfer it to Iran because the United States is desperate in Iran. But we see this everywhere. Taiwan, the U.S. supplies of arms to Iran are years behind, of Taiwan are years behind, because the U.S. needs them for Ukraine and the U.S. needs them for Tehran. The problem is we don't see anybody seriously talking about looking for peaceful off-ramps. As you and I have discussed, diplomacy has become a dirty word. And so instead of seeking kind of peaceful resolution that we need in Iran, in Lebanon, in Ukraine, in Taiwan, we see all the hawks talking about increasing military spending and looking for military victories. There are no military victories anymore. Our world has changed. And we have to live with a new reality now. I see the latest Levada polling inside of Russia. In April, the latest polling says 62% of Russians want a quick end to the war in Ukraine. 27% say they want the war to continue. We see the same thing in the US. The American people want this war with Iran to end, even if it doesn't mean, if it means a defeat for the United States. We see in the middle, in Indo-Pacific, nobody wants increased military spending, but I see US military leaders like, we could name some of them, General Minihan, warning that the US and Iran were going to be at war, the US and China be at war by 2025. I see Admiral Buchanan saying that the US has to be ready to win a three-front nuclear war against Russia, China, and North Korea, and still have enough nuclear weapons in reserve to establish global hegemony. I see this kind of thinking. I see Karganov and the hawks in Russia calling for use of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. You know, we need a different kind of thinking, because what Ukraine is proving now is that even a vastly militarily superior country in this age of asymmetric warfare cannot win wars on the battlefield. Iran is proving the same thing to the United States and the world in Southwest Asia. So we need different kind of thinking and different leadership. I'm sadly not seeing it, despite the Pope Leo's efforts, despite the efforts by the United Nations. And some of the statements coming out of, I mean, I see the statements being made by Putin and Peskov and Lavrov and Ryabkov condemning the US war in Iran. What I keep saying is they don't have the moral authority as long as the war in Ukraine continues. What we need to see is all these wars end, and Russia and China and India and the global South and the BRICS and the SCOs and the African Union talking about alternative ways for peaceful development across the planet, peaceful green development in harmony with the environment, getting off of the fossil fuel train. You know, we're seeing, for example, in the US, pulmonologists are saying that the air is so polluted that they're seeing record number of cases of asthma and other breathing disorders because the American people, the air in this country is so polluted. And you get an idiot like Trump wanting to fund more coal production. You know, what we need is new kind of leadership with a different vision for humanity.
Peter, you mentioned Pope Leo, an American from Chicago. He's a baseball fan. How can you not be if you're from Chicago?
But he's a White Sox fan, which is very dubious.
That's right. And so
the White Sox are actually doing well this year.
Yeah,
keep on waiting for them to collapse so that my
Orioles
get into the wild card.
All of those Cubs fans now, I mean, I wonder if they're going to leave the church. No, I'm just kidding. You mentioned Pope Leo. He clearly has come out against war. He's really come out against Trump.
Yes.
Without even really mentioning his name, but everybody knows it. You know what the problem I have? Now, I was born and raised Catholic. I was an active Catholic priest for 14 years.
I know.
Educated in Rome, 4 years, my postgraduate degree in Rome. And with Pope Leo coming out so strongly against war, the Catholic bishops and cardinals in the United States have been silent. Peter, where are the Berrigans? Where are the Kathy Kellys? Where are the Martin Luther Kings? Where are all those priests and nuns and Protestant ministers and Jewish rabbis that rose up together, not only against the war in Vietnam, but to bring about a change in civil rights? Peter, they're silent. And for me, that is really disheartening.
Yes.
I don't know. What are your comments on that?
You know, as you know, most of my relatives were killed in the Holocaust before I was born. And the lesson that I was always taught by my parents and grandparents is that silence is not only complicity, silence is evil. So, as a kid from early on, even before I was a teenager, I was active in the civil rights movement because I saw the egregious, flagrant evil of hatred and discrimination. And then the anti-war movement, and then the anti-nuclear movement. And the religious leaders, as you say, were always in the forefront. I see a handful now and then, and they're certainly not supporting Trump's lunacy or the hawkishness that we're seeing so rampant, but we're not seeing the kind of courageous leadership that we saw in the civil rights movement, that we saw in the anti-Vietnam War movement. When you go to 1982 and the anti-nuclear march in Central Park, 1 million people showed up. In the front lines were the priests and the Protestant clergy and the rabbis and the imams and the Muslim leaders. We're not seeing that. And that's very, very sad. We're seeing occasionally some of the political leaders showing some courage, but one of the positive things is, again, another article in the New York Times today about AIPAC, whereas the Israel lobby used to have enormous influence in the Democratic Party. You looked at the Joe Bidens, how much money they were getting from AIPAC. Now it's 80% of the Democrats condemn Israel, condemn AIPAC, refuse to take money from AIPAC, and deplore what's going on in Gaza. I see it with these students. That's the burning moral issue for this generation. The horrors that Israel is inflicting on Gaza, in Lebanon, and elsewhere. But it's got to be broader than that. And they're also very critical of the U.S. role in supporting Israel and arming Israel and defending Israel diplomatically for these outrages. That's very different than Israel than the Israel I grew up with. Where now, instead of being a moral voice in the world, Israel has become a pariah. Israel is, many of these leaders in Israel are outright fascists. This is unheard of for the Jewish community in the United States. And I'm glad to see the condemnation of Israel, not as a country that doesn't have a right to exist, but as a country that needs to play a positive role in raising standards of living peacefully throughout the region.
You mentioned a couple of things that I want to comment on. First of all, you said that silence is evil. And a great American Jesuit priest, uh, Father John Deere, has been passionate about following Jesus' example of peaceful, nonviolent resistance. And he said, I videotaped a day-long conference that he gave in I think it was 2018 or 2019, in Maine. And he basically said, silence or extinction. Take your choice. So I just wanted to put an exclamation point on what you said about that. But you're a professor at a university. You talk about your students, and you've been taking students to Japan every year to help them understand the dangers of nuclear war and war. Now, I mentioned to you earlier, I was at a conference yesterday at which I gave a short talk. There was a woman professor. She was the last one to speak at the end of this day-long conference. And I can't tell you, there must have been 25 or 30 people, mostly men, who gave talks. I don't know whether she was planned to give a talk, but they gave her a couple of minutes at the very end. And this woman is a professor of political science at Crimea State University in Simferopol. This was her message, Peter. This is what is so troubling. Apart from everything we've been talking about, she said students today are relying on artificial intelligence to get their information, to pass their exams, their tests,
To write their papers.
to write their papers. And she said, they're not learning to think. They're not learning to study, to research on their own. They're just getting it from artificial intelligence. And then she coupled it with something else, Peter. She coupled it with digital. The digital ID, technocracy, facial recognition. And she said they now have become captive victims. She only had 2 or 3 minutes. Peter, I had to go up to her afterwards and said, you gave the most important speech of all of these speeches today, 35, whatever there were, and you should have been given an hour to talk about how important this is and how all of us older people and everybody in the room, there was nobody younger, I don't think, than 40. There was a retired admiral from the Russian Soviet Navy, a retired general who are participants in this. And it was the best conference I've been to in 5-6 years here, the best. They were finally facing some real realities. But this woman came up with, I think, the most important thing that this group of people needed to hear: the effect of technocracy on future generations. Peter, it's their freaking world. If they are not equipped with the ability to think critically, to analyze what the heck is going on, to be able to figure out for themselves and do their own research. Peter, your thoughts on this? You are a classroom professor. What have you seen in terms of this?
What I've been seeing is that the humanists deplore the use of artificial intelligence by their students. However, what I'm finding in other areas is that they're embracing it. The business schools, somehow they're getting the message that what employers are looking for is students being able to use artificial intelligence to answer questions and to do assignments. They actually embrace that. They're actually teaching that. You know, what I thought the purpose of a university education is to get people to think. Not so much, it's partly to get them to have a lot of knowledge, but it's even more to teach them to ask the right questions, to think creatively. And what I'm finding more and more is that some of the lazy students, even in my classes, Although I try to make that impossible by the kinds of assignments and by making them excited about learning. That's what I see. For example, I see universities selling themselves not based upon the excitement of learning when you're a student, but based upon the prospects for making more money in the outside world after you graduate. I see universities selling themselves based upon how much money their graduates make after they get out of the schools. To me, this is the wrong message. What I convey to my students is not only the social importance of the knowledge they're gaining to make a better world, but the excitement of learning. The one time in their lives when they're going to have the opportunity to really devote themselves to learning. And I see them trying to rush through, graduate in 3 years, new degree programs where you don't need 120 degrees, 120 credits, you only need 90 credits. What is the rush? They're going to spend their entire life on the job market, but now they're all worried because with artificial intelligence, they are, they're afraid they're not going to have jobs. And so, I worry about this generation, but I see a lot of positive signs. So you mentioned, am I taking students for 25 years to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Kyoto? Well, I'm going in July because I've been asked to keynote an international peace conference in Nagasaki at the end of July. And I've got, this is sponsored by Asahi Shimbun, Japan's leading newspaper. And so I've got 7 students coming with me to Japan in July for no credits, but just because they want to learn, they want to be there, they want to experience it. Then I'm going to this alternative university program that I keynote in Italy in early August. And I've got 15 students coming with me to Italy to this conference, this alternative university program in August. Then I'm coming to give a major address in Moscow in September, a conference at which more than 5,000 people from 153 countries participated in last September. And so I'm giving a major address there. And I've also been invited to chair the documentary jury at the big Moscow International Film Festival. This is a different one that I chaired last April. This is a big one in Moscow in September. I've been asked to chair the documentary film jury there, which I'm happy to do as well. And I've got students coming with me to Moscow. So I think there are the students who are good, who don't want to rely on artificial intelligence, want to learn to think, want to change the world, want to make a better world, hate the world that they're inheriting from our generation, are really the cream of the crop. They're really the best and the brightest, the smartest, the most motivated. And I love those students. And I love the fact that they sign up for all my classes, that they know they're going to be asked to do 2 or 3 or 4 times as much work as they get from their other professors, but they don't shy away. They read all the books. They watch all the movies. They come prepared. They think about it. And, that's their treasure. So I see the negative that you're talking about, but I also see the positive. The students I love who are as good as the best students that I've had for 40 years now, teaching at American University and other universities.
Peter, you're a dear friend. You have been for a number of years. You've had more influence on me than I think you could possibly imagine. It goes back to that day. It was way back in 2012 or 13 at American University, where you introduced me to Oliver Stone, and where you, the following day, allowed me to interview you. It's been used many times and it's in my film. So I'm very grateful to you for that. And that is what led me to my life radically being changed. Uh, I became a radical activist protester against the United States government, United States history, the real history of the United States. Your work you did with Oliver Stone on the untold history of the United States deeply, deeply affected me, uh, gave me so much content uh, that shaped the rest of my life. So I'm grateful to you for that. But I also want to tell you this, Peter, before we finish, and I want the people in this audience who are familiar with you and who are watching this, I want to thank you for those 40 years of dedication you have given to students, classroom students, kids who have attended American University, kids who traveled with you to Japan, who are traveling with you to Italy, who are traveling with you to Russia. I have so much respect for you, Peter, as a professor of higher education, with the commitment you've made to get students to love learning, to explore, to ask questions, to discover, and Peter, to travel with you. Peter, you're one of my heroes. I can't thank you enough for your analysis, but I can't thank you enough for your life's mission to helping students learn and appreciate learning. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Regis. That was awfully kind and generous of you. But we've been good friends for almost 15 years now, fighting the same lonely battles, and watching our world go one step forward and two steps back, and both worrying that we're on the precipice of an irreversible mistake that could make future generations unbornable, whatever the word would be. As long as there's a future, it might not be the world you and I want to see for the next 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. But if we're still here as a species, eventually we'll get it right. And we've struggled, we've overcome the nuclear age, environmental degradation, slavery, poverty, ignorance, the dark ages. Hopefully we'll overcome the age of artificial intelligence too. I did an interview a couple of days ago with I think it might have been Izvestia TV about artificial intelligence within the nuclear command and control structure. We've had so many incidents, as you know, where we've gotten false intelligence, whether it's coming into Russia, coming into the United States, about an incoming missile attack, a nuclear missile attack. And the people in charge, rather than doing what was mandated according to strict guidelines, as human beings, intervened and refused to launch a counterattack, which was actually what was prescribed. And that's why we're still here. But artificial intelligence won't make that same human calculation, which is why this is so dangerous, and why my friends in Russia and China and Japan and everywhere around the world, including the United States, are so alarmed. We have these books warning about what this means, like Annie Jacobson's wonderful book that people should read, where she lays out minute by minute, step by step, what would happen if there's an incoming nuclear attack, one missile from North Korea. And it's terrifying. We've
You
got to
know,
figure out how
Peter,
to learn.
uh, thank you for introducing me to Annie. I've read her book, I have it. And you know that I made my film 30 Seconds to Midnight
Which is great.
because of the fear that I had. But my approach was different. It wasn't to try to frighten people, as Helen Caldicott did in my film,
Yeah.
for the consequences of nuclear war. I tried to explain for people the history of the United States from the arrival of the first white European colonialists that have led us to this day, where the whole objective was to kill people, genocide the Native Americans. It happened in South America with the Spanish, the Portuguese, the stealing of land and resources and labor, slavery. It continues to this day. And I try to point out that because of this history, Americans have been blind to the threat of humanity's very existence. I hope that that would have convinced people. But unfortunately, neither of the two arguments today seem to be very convincing to the rest of humanity.
But
Peter?
I think let me say, Regis, um, I know that in the United States, with the end of the Cold War, people went to sleep. They thought that the nuclear threat had abated. We didn't have to worry about that anymore. But what I've seen in recent years is a reawakening. I've seen it in my students. I've seen it in the public. I've seen it in the interviews. I did more than 550 mostly TV interviews around the world last year. And I give lots and lots of talks. And what I'm seeing is more and more awareness, more and more concern. It started maybe with the Oppenheimer movie. It started with my friend Dan Ellsberg. Before he passed, he did all those talks in which he expressed his heartfelt concern for the future of humanity. I've seen it with Annie Jacobson's book, which was the leading New York Times bestseller a couple of years ago. I've seen it with these HBO movies like A House of Dynamite recently in the United States and some other parts of the world. I've seen it with all the meetings I get asked to do with diplomats around the world. I saw it when I spoke. I did a side session recently at the Non-Proliferation Treaty hearings at the UN in New York. The world is waking up, but unfortunately, most people feel helpless. My
Yeah,
friend Robert J. Lifton, who passed recently at age 99, expressed it so well in his psychoanalytic studies about nuclear fear. That and nuclear, the fact that people can't contemplate this and they feel it's too big for them to actually influence in some way. Whereas in the past, in the 80s, that wasn't the case. People were mobilized, were active. They were figuring out ways to try to lessen the threat. Now people feel like it's too big for them to deal with. And the best they can do is elect better leaders. Well, that's a small step. But as you and I know, it's not sufficient. And, the world is just too dangerous. Jonathan Shell said it beautifully in 1982 in The Fate of the Earth, which he talks about the immorality of even contemplating anything that could end life on the planet, pointing out how there is absolutely no possible conceivable end for which it is worth risking the future of life on the planet to achieve, whether it's victory in Ukraine, or it's Ukraine's defeating Russia, or it's victory in Iran, or Iran defeating the United States. We need to find a different way to resolve these crises. And maybe that's what we're learning. Maybe we're learning that war is obsolete. Maybe Ukraine and Iran are finally convincing the world that
well,
even for the powerful countries, war is now obsolete, because in asymmetrical warfare, where you have cheap drones and cheap missiles against vastly expensive interceptors that are in limited supply, a weaker country can inflict so much damage on a richer country, a more powerful country. You're experiencing that in Crimea. This has to end. And, I hope that we draw that lesson, we learn that lesson, and we end war as a legitimate means of resolving conflicts. We have to find other ways to do it.